Let's answer your oil painting FAQs. So in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at some questions that people left in the comments from my more recent videos and tackling those questions one by one. The first question asks, I would love to know how many attempts Chelsea chucked away or painted over before she attained her present level of skill. So this actually ties in with a question that comes up for painters a lot, which is, how long did it take for you to get this good? Did you need art school for that? What if I'm just learning as an adult? So I would love to speak to this question more holistically. And for me, I started painting when I was 3, but I don't want you to take that to mean that I've been painting like this since I was 3. My art education was one that was very much, let's say, typical for the US education system. You know, I took art as an elective, I learned drawing with everybody else, and I didn't start really getting into painting until beginning of high school. And I did that mainly through workshops and then taking advantage of the the art electives that I had in school. So the answer to this question of how many attempts did this take or how many chucked paintings did it take to get this good? A lot, a whole lot. If you go back to the beginning of this channel, which was from like 2017 or 2018, you can already see a lot of an evolution there, and there have been probably hundreds of paintings between the paintings that you saw on my channel then and what you see now. I haven't necessarily painted consistently throughout my whole life. I haven't painted every day, every month, every year. I've had stretches where I didn't make any art at all, but I did keep coming back to it consistently, even if I did take breaks. So if you are serious about reaching a professional level with your work, either because you want to sell it or because it's simply important to you to reach that mastery and go on that journey, I'd say you're looking at thousands upon thousands of hours painting and probably several years dedicated to that journey. Now, the next question is somewhat related, and that is, how many hours does it take you to complete a painting of the size that we see on the channel? Sounds like you listened to 3 or 4 audiobooks while painting this piece, wondering how many hours total. Okay, so this really does vary by piece. Most paintings that you see on my channel, I took probably about 3 hours on. So they're going to be sped up to be about 20 minutes. That's, removing time where I'm just looking at the reference, where maybe I'm like putting out paint, places where I just am not sure what to do and I'm just looking at the painting. All of that is edited out and then the footage is sped up on top of that. So typically the shortest painting you'll see probably took me about an hour or so. The longest painting is probably about 5 hours of footage, but that's probably spread out over a month on those longer paintings that took more time. I was actually really surprised to hear that my longest painting really only took about 5 hours, because some of the paintings on this channel really, I would have sworn that those paintings were probably 15 or 20 hours, if not closer to 30, just based on the amount of prep time and how, over what period that painting actually spanned for me to make it. But in general, you can expect the actual painting time for these pieces is probably 2 or 3 hours, maybe 3 or 4 for the ones that are a little bit more involved or a little bit larger. What kind of panel do you do your paintings on? Is it linen? Yes, so most of the paintings that you see are done on Raymar panels. And they are Raymar panels that have Clausen's linen mounted onto them. The specific linen that you see for most of my videos is the C13 double primed linen. So that's an oil primer. It has 2 different layers of that primer on it. And if I recall correctly, the C13 linen refers to a little bit more of a medium weave. It has a little bit more texture. Again, if my memory serves me correctly, the C15 is the portrait grade linen. Otherwise, these 2 surfaces are identical, just with the exception of how fine the weave is. So how much texture of the linen do you see come through? I could be swapping these numbers, but in general, I paint on the medium weave. Occasionally I paint on the fine weave, but either way, I really like that Clausen's double oil primed linen. And Raymar is a really great source for it. That being said, I have mounted this kind of linen on ACM panels, aluminum panels, on my own, and I have videos on my channel showing how I did that and also how I learned not to do it. And then occasionally I've done a lead alkyd primer on ACM panels myself, but I don't really do that anymore. So most of what you see on the channel today is done on those Raymar panels. Okay, next question. Could you do a video focusing on painting backgrounds and how you decide what background would complement your painting? This is a really great question, and there's not one answer to it because there's not one way that I paint a background, and I will definitely keep this in mind for future videos. But what I'll go ahead and say for this FAQ video is I really want to have a holistic vision of what the final painting needs to look like before I actually start painting. Sometimes that's as simple as saying, okay, I'm just going to block in the big masses of the background or the overall value pattern of the background and probably just leave it somewhat abstracted. On other paintings, I really need to visualize what that looks like. So I will actually take my reference into Photoshop and I'll take little snippets of the backgrounds of other paintings so that I can get a sense for the colors and the brushwork and what it looks like just to have that abstracted brushwork. And I'll go ahead and play around with that in Photoshop, adding layer upon layer of all these little teeny pieces of different paintings until I have a really holistic picture of what that final product is going to look like. But whether I'm copying from a reference verbatim to get that background, whether I'm just leaving in a simplified version of that background, or whether I need to load something in Photoshop and actually do a test, I really want to be confident that I know what that background's going to look like. That being said, I did have a video recently where I actually did a color study in order to test out that background composition, and I'll go ahead and link that up in the upper right hand corner so you can check out that video to get a little bit more of a clear sense of what this looks like and to give you an idea of what the process looks like to figure out that background without necessarily needing to use Photoshop. The next question asks, I was wondering if you are still offering classes or if I need to wait for enrollment to open in order to work with you. And the answer to that is that I do have spots available to speak with artists to see if we are fit to work together. And if we are a fit, I would go ahead and bring you in and get you started. So I don't have set enrollment dates to work with artists. And if you want help reaching a professional level of quality in your portrait work and you want a mentorship to help you to make sure that you reach that big goal, I would love to go ahead and hear from you, and let's get the ball rolling. There's details down in the description to find out more and to apply to see if we're fit to work together. Okay, next question. What color paints do you suggest for beginning portraits? I also get a lot of questions in general on what was my palette, what were my color mixtures for this painting, can we see the palette? And I do have quite a few videos where I go over my palette. It typically stays the same painting to painting. So if you know my palette from one video, you probably know my palette for the next video. What I actually find is more useful than showing you individual color mixtures is getting you confident and comfortable with a given palette enough that you know that you can match most any color that you see in a particular painting, especially in portraits. So that's why you don't see me use my palette in every video, or you don't see me name my palette in every video. It's because it stays the same, and because I find the essential skill here is really getting that knowledge of your own palette and how to use it. Doing color charts is a really, really helpful exercise to get you to that place. And then from there, we want to get you confident in your color matching ability. Once you have that, you really don't need to see individual mixtures anymore. But to give you an overview of my palette and my recommendation for beginning portraiture, these are largely the same, but I'm going to tell you my palette first and then how I would tailor it. First and foremost, my palette, the white that I use is Williamsburg titanium white. I use titanium white instead of lead Just for safety purposes, I haven't actually used lead before. I know a lot of painters, especially portrait painters, really love it, but I've never found that I've needed it, and I kind of don't want to feel like I need to use lead if at all possible. So I use titanium, and I find that the Williamsburg titanium white is really nice consistency. The next thing you will often see on my palette is a little dab of Oleogel. It is a gel medium, it's solvent-free. It's functionally the same thing as Gamblin's solvent-free gel medium if you need to pick up an alternative to this in a local art supply store. This is just on this spot in my palette for convenience reasons. There's no important reason why I have my medium between white and the other colors, but just in case you ever get that shot of my palette and you see that like clear gel on my palette, that's what that is. So that is my go-to medium for everything. In the beginning of my paintings, you might see me thin my paint with a little bit of Gamsol, but as soon as I have a base layer that's Gamsol thinned down on my canvas, the medium I'm using from there on out is Oleogel or Gamblin solvent-free gel medium. The next item on my palette is Winsor Newton Yellow Ochre Pale. This is typically the only yellow that I need for portrait painting. Occasionally, I might put out Winsor Newton Cad Yellow Pale or Cad Lemon. And the Cad Lemon I use is by Rembrandt. Both of these colors have utility, especially for mixing really corally tones for lips. So if anybody ever has really bright colored lips in portraiture, I will often put out just a little bit of one of those two cadmium colors and mix that with a bit of permanent rose to get that lip mixture. But otherwise, I find that Yellow Ochre Pale is a really versatile yellow, and unless somebody has a bright yellow shirt, I don't need Cad Yellow on my palette. From here, that next color is Winsor Newton Permanent Rose. This is my default chromatic red or chromatic magenta, which is closer to a true primary than Cad red is. So Permanent Rose is my go-to red. Again, I use it for things like lip mixtures. I'll use it for getting a little bit of blush in the cheeks, or like if I were doing a self-portrait right now, I'd probably use Permanent Rose for like the eye area, given the makeup that I have on. Now, from here, I have a series of browns. For beginning portraiture, you don't necessarily need all of these because these really are here for convenience. I think if I were going to choose just one of these browns to put on the palette to keep things simpler for a beginner painter, I would just use Transparent Oxide Red. And my Transparent Oxide colors are all through Rembrandt. So on my palette, I have Transparent Oxide Red, Transparent Oxide Brown, and then Winsor & Newton Terra Rosa. So the transparent oxides are really similar. Transparent Oxide Brown simply gets a good bit darker, but I find that I can actually mix something really similar with Transparent Oxide Red and Ultramarine, which is why that Transparent Oxide Brown I would consider a little bit more of a convenience color. Now, Terra Rosa is more of an opaque brown, what you typically think of when you think of those earth colors, something that like dries a little bit quicker. Terra Rosa is interesting because it's a really blush colored brown. It tints out to a dusty pink or a dusty rose color. And you can get a really beautiful kind of lavenderish gray if you mix Terra Rosa and Ultramarine. That being said, I think it's a nice shortcut for mixing skin tones because it's a little bit lighter, it's a little bit more opaque, it's a little bit more desaturated than something like Transparent Oxide Red. So it can be a really nice starting place for especially like Caucasian flesh tones. And it is convenient for other mixtures, but I don't find it strictly necessary, which is why I would say it's not the first brown that I would start with for a beginner portrait painter. From here, I'm literally just visualizing the palette in my head, so I don't think I'm forgetting anything. The next color I would go over to is Rembrandt Viridian. Viridian is the only green that I have on my palette typically. I'm not doing a lot of landscape painting, so I don't need a lot of variety in my greens. And Viridian is kind of the classic go-to safe green that you see most portrait painters reach for. Super versatile. I would bring it out landscape painting as well. I would probably just have more greens if I were doing a landscape. And then the final color on the palette is Rembrandt Ultramarine Blue Deep. This is the only blue that I have on my palette, unless you really want to count my white as a blue. And if you know, you know. But I don't find that I need phthalo or cobalt or anything like that. For portrait painting, I find ultramarine does a really good job. For portrait painting, I find that ultramarine does a really good job. So if you were to pare this down, I would say you really want to have your primary colors plus white and then maybe a brown for sake of convenience. So I would think about titanium white, yellow ochre pale, permanent rose, ultramarine. That gets you your 3 primaries. And then I would add something like transparent oxide red as a little bit of a shortcut color. I really like the transparent oxides. I like having transparent paint on my palette in addition to more opaque ones. And I just find it's really beautiful, whether you're putting it down in an early layer of the piece or you just want like a really rich, translucent dark. Those transparent oxide colors are great for that. All right, the next question is, how long am I waiting to paint between layers? This is a tricky question because it comes down to the individual painting, but for me personally, if I could do everything totally wet into wet and never let a layer dry, that is absolutely how I would work. That's not always possible. Some paintings are too big to do the whole thing to a certain level of quality in one sitting. Some paintings also, my concentration just isn't there, and I understand that I need to take a break and step away. And when that is the case, it is much better to do that than to try and power through. It just leaves more work to be done when I do come back. So what you will often see is, I would say most of the time on this channel, I'm not waiting for anything to dry. The biggest kind of tell that maybe I've done this is you can see like the background behind the painting. I paint in front of a window. And you can often tell that I'm painting at a different time of day. Oftentimes I will have come back to it. Sometimes it is the next day. So the paint might be tacky, but a little bit workable. But it's not unusual for me to actually intentionally stretch that out like a week so that everything can be dry to the touch and I can oil out. And that actually brings me to the last question that I have, which is, what does oiling out mean? So oiling out is when you take a painting that's in the process of drying, the paint is no longer wet to the touch, and you intentionally put a very thin layer of oil over the part of the surface you intend to work into. This serves a couple of purposes. One, it reduces the friction or the drag on the canvas, which can give you a smoother brush stroke. So if you don't like that kind of scumbly dry brush texture and your painting has started to dry, oiling out can allow you to get that slicker brush stroke without still being working wet into wet. The other benefit to oiling out is that you might notice that as your painting starts to dry, if you haven't put a varnish on it, you'll notice that your darks might start to look hazy or like there's just permanent glare on those darks. Oiling out restores the wet sheen to those darker paints, and it helps you to see the color and the value more accurately. Putting a final varnish on a painting also accomplishes the same thing, but if you're still mid-painting, you don't want to put on a varnish and then keep working. Oiling out is sort of the, I keep trying to say middleman, but it's the intermediate step between being in the middle of the painting and being able to like put that final varnish on it. So if you're mid-painting, you really need to see your color and your value in order to finish. You're not going to put on that final varnish. You'll go ahead and oil out and then continue to work on the painting until it's finished, and then you'll put your final varnish on. That's also another really common question I get. What is that thing that I put on my paintings at the very end of the video? I don't do it in every video, and that's because some paintings, I finish painting them right before I record the voiceover that you hear me give in these videos. And some paintings I finish weeks before I actually turn it into a video. If I finish something well in advance, you will typically see me put a layer of varnish on it. And the length of time that I have to wait to put on that varnish is at a minimum 2 or 3 weeks for a product like Gamvar gloss, which is what I use. Essentially, the painting needs to be fully dry to the touch, so no paint is going to transfer onto your fingertips if you touch your painting. That is typically the litmus test for using Gamvar. I've also heard painters say that they like to take 3 months for using Gamvar just to be safe. If you're using a product that is not Gamvar, if you're using something like Conservar or something that is considered a final varnish, in that case, you need to be waiting 6 months to a year, probably at least a year if you want to stay on the conservative side. There are lots of really great varnishing videos on YouTube. I really like the one that eStoke Studios put out, and so I would check that out if you want to learn more about varnish. But if you see me putting on a layer of like clear liquid in the middle of the painting, that's me oiling out. And if you see me putting on a layer of clear liquid at the very end of the painting, that's me applying Gamvar, and the product I like is Gamvar Gloss. All right, well, that covers it. Those were the most frequently asked questions that I have seen on my videos. Thank you everybody for submitting your questions. And if you have other questions that I haven't spoken to in this video that you're curious to have answered, please let me know by dropping it in the comments. If I get a lot of these, who knows, I can go ahead and turn this into a part 2. All right, until next time, happy painting.